A routine patrol takes a shocking turn when Officer Luke Patterson detains a young black boy, suspecting him of wrongdoing in a quiet suburban neighborhood. Unbeknownst to Luke, the child's father is an FBI agent determined to uncover the truth and seek justice. What will happen when the officer's secret is exposed, and how will it change the lives of everyone involved? Subscribe to the channel and follow along to see how this powerful story unfolds. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from. It was an ordinary Tuesday evening in Greenfield Heights, a small suburban town that prided itself on its quiet streets and picture-perfect neighborhoods. Rows of modestly luxurious homes lined both sides of the tree-shaded avenues, their well-manicured lawns illuminated by the dim glow of streetlights. The faint hum of cicadas filled the air, accompanied by the occasional bark of a dog or the laughter of children playing in their front yards. It was the kind of place that seemed untouched by chaos or controversy, a town cocooned in its own sense of security and order. Officer Luke Patterson, however, saw Greenfield Heights through a different lens. As he sat in his patrol car, parked at the edge of Elmwood Park, his eyes scanned the quiet street for anything or anyone that might disturb the delicate balance of peace. For Luke, peace wasn't about the absence of crime, it was about control. He liked knowing where people were supposed to be and what they were supposed to do. In his mind, anyone who didn't fit into his version of Greenfield Heights had no business being there. At 42, Luke had spent nearly 2 decades in law enforcement. His face was weathered, with deep lines etched into his forehead, a testament to the years he claimed to have spent protecting and serving. But to many in the community, his service was tinged with suspicion, especially among its black residents. They knew him as a man quick to act on his prejudices, though Luke would argue he was simply upholding the law. As the sun dipped lower on the horizon, casting a warm orange glow across the neighborhood, Luke's attention was caught by a lone figure on a bicycle. It was a boy no older than 10 or 11, pedaling down the street with a backpack slung over his shoulders. His small frame wobbled slightly as he struggled to steer the bike uphill. Luke's eyes narrowed as he leaned forward, resting his forearm on the steering wheel. "What's a kid like him doing out here alone?" Luke muttered to himself. The boy's dark skin and oversized hoodie immediately set off alarms in Luke's mind. He'd never seen this boy before, and in Luke's world, new faces often meant trouble. The boy was Jameer Brown, a bright and curious 10-year-old with a love for adventure. His father, Marcus Brown, often joked that Jameer had FBI blood running through his veins, given how much he loved to investigate and explore. That evening, Jameer had been riding his bike back home after spending the afternoon at his friend Ethan's house. Ethan lived just 2 neighborhoods over, but to Jameer, it felt like a world away. As he pedaled, his mind was busy replaying the events of the day. He and Ethan had worked on a science project for school, building a makeshift volcano that erupted with vinegar and baking soda. Jameer couldn't wait to tell his dad about it. Marcus had always encouraged his curiosity, filling their home with books on history, science, and even crime solving. To Jameer, his dad wasn't just an FBI agent, he was a superhero. But Jameer's excitement was tempered by the creeping darkness. He glanced over his shoulder, realizing how quickly the day had turned to night. His dad would be worried if he didn't get home soon. Almost there, Jameer whispered to himself, his voice steadying his nerves as he pedaled faster. Luke Patterson watched as Jameer reached the top of the hill and began coasting down toward the more affluent part of Greenfield Heights. Luke had patrolled this area for years and prided himself on knowing everyone who lived there. As far as he was concerned, this kid didn't belong. Flicking on his patrol car's headlights, Luke pulled out from his spot and began following the boy. His tires rolled slowly along the asphalt, his eyes never leaving the figure on the bike. Jameer, noticing the headlights behind him, felt a chill run down his spine. He glanced back and saw the police car. At first he thought nothing of it, but as the car continued to trail him, his unease grew. The sound of a police siren suddenly pierced the quiet night, and Jameer's heart leapt. He instinctively pulled his bike to the side of the road and came to a shaky stop. The patrol car pulled up behind him, its lights casting an eerie red and blue glow onto the street. Luke stepped out of the car, his boots hitting the pavement with a heavy thud. He adjusted his belt and walked toward Jameer, his hand resting casually on the holster of his gun. "Hey kid," Luke called out, his voice sharp and commanding. "What are you doing out here?" Jameer looked up, his wide eyes reflecting both fear and confusion. "I'm just riding home, sir," he said, his voice trembling slightly. Home, Luke said, his eyes narrowing as he sized the boy up. Where's home? Just a couple of streets over, Jameer replied. On Maplewood Drive. Luke raised an eyebrow. Maplewood Drive was one of the wealthiest streets in town. He didn't buy it. Maplewood, Luke repeated, his tone dripping with skepticism. What's in the backpack? Jameer hesitated, clutching the straps of his bag tighter. Just my school stuff, he said. Mind if I take a look? Luke asked, though his tone made it clear it wasn't a request. Jameer's grip on the bag tightened. It's just books and papers, he insisted, his voice barely above a whisper. Luke stepped closer, looming over the boy. Let me see the bag, he said firmly. Reluctantly, Jameer slid the backpack off his shoulders and handed it to Luke. The officer unzipped it and rummaged through its contents. As Jameer had said, it was filled with nothing but notebooks, pencils, and a tattered library book on volcanoes. H.M.P. Luke grunted, tossing the bag back to Jameer. What are you really doing out here? I told you, I'm going home, Jameer said, his voice firmer now, though his hands trembled as he clutched his bag. Luke's gaze hardened. It's a little late for a kid to be out on his own, don't you think? Back at home, Jameer's mother, Patrice, was setting the table for dinner. She glanced at the clock and frowned. He should have been home by now, she muttered, picking up her phone to call Marcus. Marcus was just finishing up at the FBI field office when his phone buzzed. He answered immediately, his voice calm but tinged with concern. What's wrong? It's Jameer, Patrice said. He hasn't come home yet. Marcus felt his chest tighten. Did he text or call? No, and it's not like him to be late without letting us know. I'm on my way, Marcus said, already grabbing his coat. We'll find him. Meanwhile, Luke was growing increasingly agitated. He didn't like being challenged, especially by a kid. In his mind, Jameer's calmness was an active sign of defiance. I think you need to come with me, Luke said, grabbing Jameer's arm. Wait, why? Jameer protested, panic rising in his voice. Because I said so, Luke snapped. We'll sort this out at the station. But Luke had no intention of taking Jameer to the station. He didn't want the hassle of paperwork or the scrutiny of his colleagues. Instead, he decided he'd handle this himself, teach the boy a lesson about respect and knowing his place. Jameer tried to resist, but Luke's grip was firm. He led the boy to his patrol car, ignoring his protests. As he opened the back door, Jameer's heart raced. He didn't understand what was happening, but he knew it wasn't right. The night's stillness was broken as the car door slammed shut, trapping Jameer inside. Back at the Brown household, the clock ticked loudly in the silence, each passing second amplifying Patrice Brown's growing worry. She paced the living room, her phone in one hand, repeatedly glancing out the window as if expecting to see her son come riding up on his bike. The warm aroma of the dinner she had cooked, a pot roast with vegetables, one of Jameer's favorites, hung in the air, but her appetite had evaporated. She dialed Marcus's number again. It rang twice before he picked up. I'm in the car, Marcus said briskly, his voice steadier than he felt. What's the latest? Nothing, Patrice replied, her voice trembling. I've called Ethan's mom, and she said Jameer left their house more than an hour ago. It doesn't make sense, he knows his way home. Marcus tightened his grip on the steering wheel, his FBI-trained mind already running through possibilities. Jameer was a responsible, level-headed boy. If he was late, something had to be wrong. Stay home, Marcus said, his voice firm. I'm heading toward Ethan's neighborhood to trace his route. If he calls or comes home, you call me immediately. Patrice nodded, though she knew Marcus couldn't see her. Be careful, she said softly before hanging up. Marcus drove with purpose, his FBI badge tucked in his jacket pocket, though the sight of it in this town wouldn't always help. As he passed rows of houses, their porch lights casting long shadows across the neatly trimmed lawns, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. He knew every corner of Greenfield Heights and had studied the patterns of the town for years. This wasn't the kind of place where kids simply disappeared unless someone made them. He stopped at the entrance to Elmwood Park, where Jameer might have taken a shortcut on his bike. The park was dark now, its winding paths barely illuminated by a handful of flickering lamps. Marcus got out of the car and called his son's name, his voice cutting through the still night. "Jamir," he yelled, listening for any sound, any sign of movement. The only response was the rustling of leaves in the light breeze. He shined his flashlight across the park, his eyes scanning for anything: a dropped backpack, Jamir's bike, footprints in the dirt paths. His breath puffed visibly in the crisp evening air as he crouched near a playground, his fingers brushing the ground for clues. Nothing. Marcus rose, frustration boiling beneath his calm exterior. He dialed Patrice again. "I'm heading toward the next neighborhood. If he took the longer route, I'll catch him there." "Do you think someone?" Patrice began, but her voice caught. She didn't want to finish the question. "Don't jump to conclusions," Marcus said, though he could feel his own anxiety climbing. "We'll find him." Miles away, Officer Luke Patterson pulled into the driveway of his small, single-story home. The house was neat and unassuming, a contrast to the turmoil brewing within. Inside, his wife Laura was washing dishes, her face lit by the warm glow of the kitchen lamp. She glanced up as Luke entered, the creak of the front door breaking the quiet. "You're home early," Laura said, drying her hands on a towel. "Everything okay?" Luke didn't respond immediately. He walked past her into the living room, where the faint sound of a TV sitcom filled the air. His movements were sharp, tense. He glanced back toward the patrol car parked outside. Jamir was still in the back seat, his wide eyes peering out from behind the glass. Laura followed his gaze and frowned. "Luke, what's going on?" Luke sighed, rubbing his temples. "There's a kid," he said finally. "Caught him wandering where he didn't belong." Laura folded her arms. "You brought a kid home? Instead of the station?" Luke turned to her, his jaw tightening. "Do you have any idea what happens when you bring in someone like him to the station? I'll get nothing but paperwork, lectures from the brass, and scrutiny from those community watchdog groups." "So instead you're—" "What? Keeping him here?" Laura asked, incredulous. "It's temporary," Luke snapped. "I'll scare him straight, make sure he doesn't try anything like this again." Laura stared at her husband, her expression a mixture of disbelief and disappointment. "Luke, this is insane. He's a child. What if someone's looking for him?" "They won't be," Luke said dismissively. "A kid like that? Probably up to no good anyway." Jamir sat on the cold cement floor of Luke's basement, his backpack still clutched tightly in his lap. The room smelled musty, with old furniture and boxes stacked in the corners. A single bare bulb hung from the ceiling, casting harsh light that made the space feel even smaller. His heart pounded in his chest, his mind racing with questions. Why had this man brought him here? What was going to happen next? He thought about his parents, about how worried they must be. Jamir wasn't the type to cry easily, but tears welled up in his eyes as the reality of the situation set in. He took a deep breath, remembering what his dad had taught him: stay calm. Think clearly. Look for a way out. His eyes darted around the room, searching for anything he could use to escape. The only door was locked from the outside, and the tiny, high-set window was barred. Meanwhile, Marcus had reached the intersection near Maplewood Drive. He parked his car and stepped out, calling Jamir's name again. He walked the length of the street, stopping to ask a jogger if they'd seen a boy on a bike. The joggers shook their head, apologizing before continuing on. Marcus's phone buzzed. It was Patrice. Anything she asked, though her voice already carried the answer. "No," Marcus replied, his frustration evident. "I'm heading to the station. I'll have them put out a notice." Back at Luke's house, one of his neighbors, an elderly woman named Mrs. Foster, sat on her porch sipping tea. She had seen Luke pull up earlier and noticed the boy in the back of the patrol car. It wasn't the first time she'd seen Luke act out of line. He was notorious for his heavy-handed approach, especially toward anyone he deemed suspicious. Something about the situation didn't sit right with her. She picked up her phone and dialed the non-emergency line for the police department. "This is probably nothing," she said when an officer answered. "But I saw Officer Patterson bring a young boy to his house in his patrol car. It just seemed unusual." At the station, Marcus explained the situation to the on-duty officer, showing him a picture of Jamir. "He's missing," Marcus said firmly, "and I need all available units to search." The officer frowned, clearly trying to brush it off. Kids get lost all the time, sir. He's probably at a friend's house. Marcus leaned in, his FBI badge glinting under the fluorescent light. This isn't just some kid. This is my son, and you will help me find him. The officer's demeanor shifted, and he quickly relayed the information over the radio. Back in the basement, Luke finally came down, his boots echoing on the stairs. He carried a plate of food, some hastily made peanut butter sandwiches, and set it on a small table near Jameer. You're going to sit here and think about your choices, Luke said, his tone cold. Kids like you don't just wander into neighborhoods like this for no reason. Jameer looked up at him, his voice small but steady. I wasn't doing anything wrong. Luke smirked. That's what they all say. The sound of a car pulling into the driveway interrupted them. Luke froze, his hand instinctively moving toward his holster. Stay here, he ordered, locking the door behind him as he went upstairs. Jameer sat silently, his mind racing. Whoever was outside, he hoped they could help. The Greenfield Heights police station buzzed with quiet activity, a stark contrast to Marcus Brown's storm of emotions. He stood in the lobby, his towering presence commanding attention. His FBI badge was now clipped to his belt, a clear signal that this was no ordinary missing child case. The on-duty officer, clearly uneasy under Marcus's stern gaze, shuffled awkwardly as he waited for his supervisor to arrive. Officer Marcus said, his voice calm but razor-sharp, "What's the ETA on the Bolo alert?" The younger officer stammered. It's being processed, sir. Should be up within the hour." Unacceptable, Marcus snapped, his tone like a whip. This isn't a situation where we wait and hope for the best. My son has been missing for hours, and I need every available unit looking for him now. Before the officer could respond, the station doors swung open, and a tall woman in a Greenfield Heights police captain's uniform strode in. Captain Elena Sanchez was well regarded in the community for her level-headed leadership, though even she couldn't ignore the tension Marcus brought into the room. Her dark eyes locked onto him immediately. "Agent Brown," she said, extending her hand. "Captain Sanchez, I was briefed on the situation. Let's move to my office." Marcus followed her silently, his body coiled with a mix of anxiety and determination. Once inside, Captain Sanchez closed the door and gestured for him to sit. He didn't. "We need to act fast," Marcus said, getting straight to the point. "My son is missing, and the clock is ticking. I want roadblocks, door-to-door canvassing, and every officer briefed." Sanchez nodded, her expression serious. "We've already issued a preliminary alert. I've got patrols combing through his usual routes. But Agent Brown, I need to be honest with you, Greenfield Heights doesn't have the resources for a full-scale operation." Marcus leaned forward, his hands braced on her desk. "Then let me be clear, if you don't have the resources, I do. I'll mobilize FBI field agents, state troopers, whatever it takes. But if I find out this department delayed action because of jurisdictional red tape..." He let the unspoken threat hang in the air. Sanchez didn't flinch, though she understood the weight of his words. "Understood," she said firmly. "We're on the same side, Agent. Let's start with the basics. Any chance he ran away?" "A misunderstanding." "Jameer isn't the type to run away," Marcus replied, his voice tight. "He's responsible. If he's late, it's because something is preventing him from coming home." Sanchez jotted notes on a pad. "You mentioned he was last seen near Elmwood Park." "Yes," Marcus said. "It's the halfway point between his friend's house and ours. I checked the park myself. Nothing." Sanchez tapped her pen against the desk, thinking. "That area is usually quiet, but we'll double-check. There's one officer patrolling that route tonight, Patterson." The name sparked something in Marcus. "Patterson," he repeated. "I've heard of him. He's got a reputation." Sanchez sighed. "He's old school. But I don't think he'd ignore protocol." Marcus's sharp glare silenced her. "Reputation aside, he's the last piece of this puzzle. Where is he now?" "I'll get his location," Sanchez said, picking up her radio. Meanwhile, at Luke Patterson's house, things were beginning to unravel. He paced the living room, his nerves frayed. Jameer's presence in the basement weighed heavily on him. though he refused to admit, even to himself, that he had made a grave mistake. Laura watched him from the kitchen, her arms crossed. This isn't just going to blow over, Luke. You need to let that boy go. Luke spun to face her, his expression hard. And what? Let him run back and tell his parents some sob story about how the big bad cop scared him? No, he needs to understand there are consequences. Laura's face softened, but her voice carried a sharp edge. The only one who's going to face consequences is you. This isn't teaching him a lesson. This is kidnapping. Luke bristled at the word, though he couldn't deny its truth. He ran a hand through his graying hair, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. Look, he said, his tone softer but still defensive. I just need more time to figure this out. Time for what? Luke, Laura asked. For this to get worse. Down in the basement, Jameer sat cross-legged on the cold floor, his thoughts a whirlwind of fear and defiance. He could hear the muffled voices of Luke and Laura upstairs, though he couldn't make out their words. His mind raced with possibilities. Would his parents find him? Would this officer hurt him? He had no answers, but he clung to one thing his father always said: you're stronger than you think. He closed his eyes and took a deep breath, steadying himself. If he couldn't get out, he'd need to find a way to send a message. His eyes scanned the room, settling on an old, dusty shelf stacked with tools and paint cans. One of the cans had a label peeling off, revealing its shiny metal surface. An idea sparked. Jameer grabbed the can and began scratching the word help onto its side with a nail he'd found on the floor. It wasn't much, but it was something. Back at the station, Sanchez's radio crackled with an update. Patterson's patrol car was logged returning to his residence about 2 hours ago, an officer reported. Marcus's jaw tightened. Why would he bring his patrol car home in the middle of a shift? Sanchez frowned, her unease matching Marcus's. That's not standard procedure. Marcus stood abruptly. Give me his address. Agent Brown, let's not jump to conclusions, Sanchez began, but Marcus cut her off. Captain, we don't have time for assumptions. If Patterson's involved, I need to know now. Sanchez hesitated, then handed him a slip of paper. Be careful, she warned, if you're wrong. I'm not, Marcus said, already heading for the door. Marcus pulled into Luke's driveway, his car idling as he assessed the scene. The house was dark, except for a faint glow coming from a basement window. He noted the patrol car parked outside, its presence confirming his suspicions. He approached the front door and knocked firmly, his badge clipped visibly to his belt. After a moment, Laura answered, her face pale and strained. Can I help you? She asked, her voice trembling slightly. I'm Special Agent Marcus Brown with the FBI, he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. I'm looking for my son, Jameer. Is he here? Laura's eyes widened, panic flashing across her face. Before she could answer, Luke appeared behind her, his face hard as stone. What's this about? Luke demanded, his tone defensive. Marcus stepped forward, his gaze piercing. My son is missing, and your behavior raises serious questions. I'm here to find out if you have anything to do with it. Luke's posture stiffened. You accusing me of something? Not yet, Marcus said, his voice low and controlled. But unless you want me to turn this into a federal case, I suggest you start talking. Down in the basement, Jameer heard the faint sound of voices at the front door. His heart leapt. Was it his dad? He grabbed the scratched paint can and held it close, ready to signal if the opportunity arose. For the first time since the ordeal began, he felt a glimmer of hope. Luke Patterson stood firm in his doorway, the weight of Marcus Brown's words pressing down on him. Marcus, his FBI badge glinting faintly in the porch light, exuded an authority Luke couldn't easily dismiss. Still, the officer's pride and deeply ingrained prejudices refused to let him back down. I don't know what you're implying, Luke said, his tone laced with feigned innocence, but I don't appreciate being accused of something I haven't done. Marcus stepped closer, his eyes narrowing. Let's cut through the act, Officer Patterson. My son is missing, and your patrol car was last seen in the same area he was. Now, I'm giving you a chance to come clean. Behind Luke, Laura stood frozen in the hallway, her expression a mix of fear and guilt. She glanced toward the basement door, the weight of what she knew gnawing at her. "There's no boy here," Luke said curtly. "You're barking up the wrong tree." Marcus's patience, already worn thin, snapped. "Enough," he barked, his voice booming. He pushed past Luke into the house, his eyes scanning every corner for any sign of Jameer. "Hey," Luke shouted, grabbing Marcus's arm. "You can't just barge in here." Marcus shrugged off Luke's grip and spun to face him, his expression dark. "I have every reason to believe my son is in this house. Unless you want me to call in a warrant, I suggest you stay out of my way." Laura took a hesitant step forward, her voice trembling. "Luke, maybe you should just—" "Stay out of this," Luke snapped, cutting her off. His outburst only deepened her anxiety, and Marcus caught the shift in her demeanor. Turning to Laura, Marcus softened his tone. "Ma'am, if you know anything at all, you need to tell me. My son's life depends on it." Laura opened her mouth, but Luke's glare silenced her. She looked away, clutching the edge of the counter as if steadying herself. Jameer heard the commotion upstairs, his ears straining to pick up details. He recognized his father's voice, a wave of relief washing over him, but he knew he wasn't safe yet. The locked basement door loomed over him like a barrier between hope and escape. He clutched the scratched paint can tighter, his small hands trembling. Glancing at the narrow window above him, he noticed faint shadows moving across it. Maybe someone outside could see him. He grabbed an old broom from the corner and used it to knock the can against the bars of the window, creating a rhythmic clang. "Come on," he whispered to himself, his heart pounding. "Someone hear me." Upstairs, Marcus's eyes landed on the basement door, its edges faintly scuffed as if it had been opened and shut hastily. He took a step toward it, but Luke blocked his path. "You've got no right to search my house," Luke said, his voice rising. "I've told you already your son isn't here." Marcus didn't flinch. "Move," he said, his voice cold and unyielding. "Not without a warrant," Luke countered, his hand resting on his holster. The room fell into a tense silence, the air crackling with unspoken threats. Laura's breath hitched as she glanced between the two men. Marcus could see her hesitation, the silent battle playing out in her mind. "You think your badge gives you the right to come in here and throw accusations," Luke continued, his voice dripping with contempt. "This is my home." Marcus's jaw clenched. He was moments away from forcing his way past Luke when a faint metallic clanging reached his ears. His heart skipped a beat. "What's that sound?" Marcus demanded, his sharp gaze darting toward the basement. Luke's face betrayed him for a split second, a flicker of panic flashing in his eyes. Marcus seized the moment and stepped toward the door, but Luke grabbed his arm again. "Back off," Luke shouted, his voice cracking slightly. Laura gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. She could no longer stand by. "Luke, stop," she cried. "You can't keep this up." Marcus pulled free of Luke's grasp and shoved him aside, his adrenaline surging. He grabbed the basement door handle and yanked it open, his flashlight cutting through the darkness below. "Jameer," he called, his voice echoing down the stairs. "Dad," came the desperate reply. Marcus nearly collapsed with relief at the sound of his son's voice. Without hesitation, he descended the stairs, his flashlight illuminating the small, cluttered basement. There, in the corner, was Jameer, clutching a battered paint can and looking up at his father with tear-filled eyes. "Dad," Jameer cried again, running into Marcus's arms. Marcus knelt, holding his son tightly, his heart hammering in his chest. "You're okay," Marcus murmured, his voice breaking. "You're okay." Upstairs, Luke stood frozen at the top of the stairs, his face pale. Laura, no longer able to contain her disgust, turned to him. "How could you do this?" she demanded, her voice shaking. "He's just a child." "Don't lecture me," Luke snapped, though his bravado had faltered. "I was handling the situation." "Handling," Laura repeated, her voice rising. "You locked a boy in our basement like some kind of criminal. What's wrong with you?" Marcus reappeared at the top of the stairs, Jameer clinging to his side. His expression was pure fury as he faced Luke. "You're going to answer for this," Marcus said, his voice low but deadly. "You don't get to walk away from what you've done." Luke opened his mouth to argue, but Marcus wasn't interested in hearing excuses. He pulled out his phone and dialed Captain Sanchez. "This is Brown," he said when she picked up. "I found my son. He's safe, but there's been a development. I'm at Officer Patterson's residence. Send backup." Sanchez's sharp intake of breath was audible even over the phone. "Understood. I'm on my way." Within minutes, the street outside Luke's house was filled with flashing lights as squad cars and unmarked FBI vehicles arrived. Captain Sanchez was the first to step out, her face a mixture of shock and anger as she took in the scene. Marcus met her at the door, Jameer still at his side. "My son was locked in Patterson's basement," Marcus said, his voice steely. "I expect immediate action." Sanchez's expression hardened. She turned to her officers. "Secure the scene. Patterson, you're relieved of duty, effective immediately." Luke started to protest, but Sanchez silenced him with a glare. "Save it. You'll have plenty of time to explain yourself during the investigation." As Luke was escorted outside, the weight of his actions finally seemed to hit him. He glanced back at Laura, but she turned away, unable to meet his eyes. Back in the house, Marcus knelt in front of Jameer, his hands resting gently on his son's shoulders. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice soft. Jameer shook his head. "I'm okay, Dad. I was scared, but I knew you'd come." Marcus's throat tightened, and he pulled Jameer into another hug. "You're so brave," he whispered. "I'm so proud of you." Captain Sanchez approached them, her expression sympathetic. "Agent Brown will handle the rest from here. Take your son home." Marcus nodded, his gratitude unspoken but evident in his eyes. He stood, guiding Jameer toward the door. As they walked out into the cool night air, Marcus glanced down at his son. "Let's go home, buddy," he said, his voice steady for the first time all evening. The air in Greenfield Heights buzzed with the aftermath of the confrontation at Luke Patterson's home. Marcus Brown had taken Jameer home, but his mind was far from at ease. His FBI instincts told him this wasn't just about one rogue officer. There was a larger system at play, a system that allowed someone like Patterson to feel emboldened enough to take matters into his own hands. For Marcus, this was no longer just about his son's safety, it was about justice. Sitting in the quiet of his living room, Marcus watched Jameer sleep on the couch, the boy's small body curled under a blanket. Patrice sat beside him, her hand clutching his tightly. "He's safe," she whispered, breaking the silence. "That's all that matters." "No," Marcus said firmly, his eyes never leaving Jameer. "It's not all that matters. What if this had happened to another kid? What if I wasn't FBI? What if we didn't have the resources to fight back?" Patrice nodded, tears welling in her eyes. "What do we do now?" "We fight," Marcus said, his voice resolute. "We make sure this never happens again, not here, not anywhere." The next morning, Marcus was back at the Greenfield Heights police station, this time in an official capacity. Captain Sanchez met him in her office, her demeanor professional but tense. "We've detained Patterson," she began, gesturing to a report on her desk. "He's been suspended without pay pending a full investigation. I've also reported the incident to Internal Affairs." "Not enough," Marcus said bluntly. "This isn't just about Patterson. He didn't wake up one day and decide to kidnap a child. He's a product of a system that tolerates this kind of behavior. I want to know how many complaints have been filed against him. I want to know why nothing was done before now." Sanchez sighed, her shoulders slumping slightly. "You're right. Patterson's record isn't clean. There have been multiple complaints over the years, mostly for excessive force and racial profiling. But—" she hesitated, choosing her next words carefully. "Those complaints never led to disciplinary action. They were dismissed or buried." Marcus's jaw tightened. "Buried by who?" "Previous leadership," Sanchez admitted. "I inherited a lot of problems when I took over. Patterson slipped through the cracks." "Cracks," Marcus repeated bitterly. "Those cracks nearly swallowed my son." Sanchez met his gaze, her expression determined. "You have my word, Agent Brown. We'll dig into this and we'll hold people accountable. But I need your help. Patterson's actions go beyond local misconduct. If there's evidence of systemic corruption, we'll need federal oversight." Marcus nodded. "You'll have it. I'll contact my team and get them involved." As news of the incident spread, the town of Greenfield Heights erupted in outrage. Some residents were horrified that an officer they had trusted could commit such an act, while others defended Patterson, claiming he had simply made a mistake. For the town's black community, however, this was no surprise. For years, they had endured the unspoken bias that lurked beneath Greenfield Heights' picturesque surface. Patterson's arrest was a vindication of their experiences, but it was also a painful reminder of how much work remained to be done. Marcus found himself at the center of the storm. Community leaders reached out to him, asking for guidance and support. One such leader was Reverend Samuel Carter, a fiery preacher who had long been an advocate for racial equality in Greenfield Heights. "You've got the power to make real change here," Reverend Carter said during a meeting at the local community center. "We need to rally the people, demand accountability, and force this town to reckon with its ugly truths." Marcus nodded. "I'm with you, Reverend. But this can't just be about one bad cop. We need to expose the whole system." "And we will," Carter replied. "But we'll need to be smart about it. The folks defending Patterson are already spinning this as a one-off incident. We can't let them control the narrative." While the town debated his actions, Luke Patterson sat alone in an interrogation room at the police station. Stripped of his badge and uniform, he looked smaller, his bravado gone. Across the table sat Marcus, his expression unreadable. "I don't know why you're here," Luke said, his voice hoarse. "You've already ruined my life." "No," Marcus replied calmly. "You ruined your own life. I'm just here to understand why." Luke scoffed, leaning back in his chair. "You wouldn't understand." "Try me," Marcus said, his tone sharp. For a moment, Luke was silent. Then he leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "You think you're better than me, don't you? With your badge, your perfect family, your high and mighty attitude. But you don't get it. You don't know what it's like to be a cop in a town like this." "And what's that like?" Marcus asked, his voice dangerously quiet. "Tell me, Officer Patterson, what's it like to justify kidnapping a 10-year-old boy?" Luke flinched but recovered quickly. "I was protecting this town. Kids like your son." "Kids like my son," Marcus interrupted, his voice rising. "You mean black kids? Just say it." Luke didn't respond, but the flicker of guilt in his eyes betrayed him. "You weren't protecting anyone," Marcus continued. "You were feeding your own prejudice. You saw my son, and you didn't see a boy riding his bike home. You saw a threat. And that mindset, your mindset, is exactly why I'm here. To make sure this town never lets someone like you wear a badge again." That evening, a town hall meeting was held at the community center. The room was packed, the air thick with tension as residents from every corner of Greenfield Heights gathered to discuss the incident. On one side were those demanding justice for Jameer and accountability for Patterson's actions. On the other were Patterson's defenders, many of whom dismissed the situation as an overreaction. Marcus stood at the front of the room, flanked by Reverend Carter and Captain Sanchez. When the crowd finally quieted, Marcus stepped forward to speak. "My son was taken from the street by a man who was supposed to protect this community," Marcus began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "But this isn't just about my family. This is about a system that allowed that man to feel justified in his actions, a system that failed all of us." A murmur rippled through the crowd, but Marcus pressed on. "For years, people in this town have ignored the signs. Complaints dismissed, voices silenced, but not anymore. I'm here to tell you that change is coming, and I need all of you to decide which side of history you want to be on." The room erupted into applause from some and angry shouts from others. One man stood up, his face red with anger. "Patterson's a good cop. He made a mistake, and now you're trying to ruin his life." "A mistake," Marcus shot back. "Kidnapping a child isn't a mistake. It's a crime. And the only reason it happened is because people like you refused to hold him accountable." The man sat down, his anger overshadowed by the crowd's cheers. By the end of the night, Marcus had gained the support of many in the community, but he knew the fight was far from over. The investigation into Patterson and the police department would take months, and the scars left by the incident would take even longer to heal. As he drove home with Patrice and Jameer, Marcus felt a mix of exhaustion and determination. His son had faced something no child should ever have to endure, but Marcus was determined to turn that pain into progress. Looking at Jameer in the rearview mirror, Marcus felt a swell of pride. His son had been through hell, but he had emerged stronger. "You did good, buddy," Marcus said, his voice soft. Jameer smiled faintly. "Thanks, Dad." Marcus nodded, gripping the steering wheel tighter. This was just the beginning, but for the first time in days he felt a glimmer of hope. The aftermath of the town hall meeting left Greenfield Heights in turmoil. Lines had been drawn. On one side were those who demanded justice for Jameer and systemic reforms in the police department. On the other were those who clung to the idea that Officer Luke Patterson was merely a misunderstood figure who had made a bad decision, but the cracks in the town's idyllic facade were no longer ignorable. Marcus Brown, however, wasn't interested in debating the town's morality. His focus had shifted to a larger mission, exposing and dismantling the rot within the system that had endangered his son. At the FBI field office, Marcus sat in a conference room filled with case files, police records, and witness testimonies. He was joined by Special Agent Rachel Lee, a seasoned investigator known for her tenacity. The two had worked together before, and Marcus trusted her implicitly. "What do we have on Patterson?" Marcus asked, his eyes scanning the stack of papers in front of him. Rachel pulled out a folder, flipping it open to reveal a timeline of complaints against Patterson. Excessive force, racial profiling, verbal abuse. 10 complaints over the past 5 years. None resulted in disciplinary action. "Why not?" Marcus asked, though he suspected the answer. Rachel shrugged. The complaints were either dismissed due to insufficient evidence or quietly buried. And get this, 3 of the complainants were threatened with countercharges. They dropped their cases after being intimidated. Marcus's jaw tightened. This isn't incompetence. This is deliberate. Rachel nodded. "It gets worse. I dug into the records of Patterson's superiors. Turns out the former police chief Harding actively shielded him. Harding retired last year with a full pension, but he left behind a culture of impunity." Marcus leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. If Harding was protecting Patterson, who else was he covering for? Rachel slid another file across the table. "I ran background checks on all the officers who served under Harding. Patterson isn't the only one with a record. 3 other officers have multiple complaints of misconduct. One of them, Officer Daniels, was involved in a wrongful arrest case that the department quietly settled out of court." Marcus exhaled slowly, his resolve hardening. This isn't just about Patterson. It's the entire department. While Marcus and Rachel dug deeper into the police department's history, the town's black community rallied together to demand accountability. Reverend Carter organized a peaceful protest in front of the police station, drawing hundreds of residents from all walks of life. Signs bearing slogans like "Justice for Jameer" and "End Police Corruption" filled the air, accompanied by chants for change. Patrice and Jameer joined the protest, standing alongside their neighbors. Patrice held Jameer's hand tightly, her other hand gripping a sign that read, "Our children deserve better." Jameer, though still shaken by his ordeal, stood tall, his presence a powerful reminder of what was at stake. Reverend Carter's voice boomed through a megaphone as he addressed the crowd. "We are here today because one of our own, a child, was targeted by the very people sworn to protect him. But this is not an isolated incident. This is a symptom of a system that values power over justice, fear over fairness, and we will not stand for it any longer." The crowd erupted into cheers, their voices echoing through the streets. For the first time in years, the community felt united, their collective pain transforming into a force for change. Meanwhile, Luke Patterson sat in a small holding cell, awaiting his arraignment. His once pristine uniform had been replaced by an orange jumpsuit, and the badge he had worn with pride now felt like a distant memory. He stared at the concrete wall, his mind replaying the events that had led him there. He thought about his father, a retired cop who had taught him that law enforcement was about respect and control. "If you don't command respect, they'll walk all over you," his father had said countless times. Luke had taken those words to heart. But now, sitting alone in the cold cell, he wondered if he had misunderstood them. The cell door creaked open, and Captain Sanchez stepped inside. She crossed her arms, her expression unreadable. "Patterson," she said, her voice cold, "do you have any idea what you've done? Not just to that boy, but to this department." Luke didn't respond, his gaze fixed on the floor. Sanchez continued, her tone sharpening. You've disgraced the badge, you've betrayed the trust of this community. And for what? To satisfy your own ego? Your own prejudices? Finally, Luke looked up, his face etched with regret. I thought I was doing the right thing, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Sanchez shook her head. The right thing? You kidnapped a child, you abused your power, and now you'll face the consequences. Back at the FBI office, Marcus and Rachel made a breakthrough. They uncovered a series of emails between Chief Harding and the city's mayor, revealing a coordinated effort to suppress complaints against officers like Patterson. The emails outlined a strategy to avoid public scrutiny by quietly settling cases and intimidating complainants into silence. Marcus forwarded the evidence to the Justice Department, knowing it would trigger a federal investigation into the Greenfield Heights Police Department. But he also knew the battle wasn't over. Public accountability would be just as important as legal consequences. With the evidence in hand, Marcus returned to Greenfield Heights for another town hall meeting. This time, the room was even more crowded, the tension palpable. Reverend Carter and Captain Sanchez joined Marcus at the front, while members of the community packed the seats. Marcus stepped forward, holding up a stack of papers. What I have here, he began, his voice steady, are emails between the former police chief and the mayor. These documents prove that they actively worked to suppress complaints against officers, including Luke Patterson. This isn't just about one bad cop. This is about a system designed to protect itself at the expense of the people it serves. The room erupted into murmurs, some voices filled with outrage, others with disbelief. We have a choice, Marcus continued. We can allow this corruption to continue, or we can demand better leadership, better oversight, better accountability. Reverend Carter took the microphone next. Change doesn't happen overnight, he said. But tonight, we're taking the first step. We will not let this injustice be swept under the rug. By the end of the meeting, the community had agreed to form a civilian oversight committee to monitor the police department. The mayor, under intense pressure, announced his resignation, and the state attorney general launched an investigation into the department's practices. For Marcus, it was a step in the right direction, but he knew the fight wasn't over. As he walked out of the community center with Patrice and Jameer, he looked up at the night sky, the stars faintly visible through the city lights. We did good tonight, Patrice said, her voice filled with quiet pride. Marcus nodded, his hand resting on Jameer's shoulder. We did. But this is just the beginning. The morning air was crisp, a sharp contrast to the simmering tension that had gripped Greenfield Heights for weeks. Marcus Brown stood outside the community center, watching as volunteers set up tables and chairs for the town's first ever community oversight committee meeting. The crowd gathering in the parking lot was diverse residents of all ages, races, and backgrounds united by a shared determination to rebuild trust and hold the police accountable. Jameer stood beside Marcus, his small hand wrapped around his father's. Though he still bore the emotional scars of his ordeal, his posture was more confident now. He had become a symbol of resilience, and his courage had inspired others to take action. Ready, son? Marcus asked, his voice soft. Jameer nodded, his gaze steady. Yeah, Dad, I'm ready. Inside the community center, the energy was palpable. Rows of folding chairs filled the main hall, while a long table at the front served as the dais for the newly elected oversight committee. Reverend Carter, seated at the center of the dais, adjusted his glasses and smiled at the crowd. Thank you all for being here today, he began, his voice carrying a tone of hope. This committee represents a new chapter for Greenfield Heights, a chapter where transparency and accountability are no longer optional, but mandatory. The audience erupted into applause. Marcus sat near the front, his FBI badge clipped to his belt, as a reminder of his dual role as both a father and an advocate for justice. Reverend Carter continued, outlining the committee's goals: conducting independent investigations into police misconduct, reviewing department policies, and advocating for reforms that prioritize community safety over systemic bias. He then turned the microphone over to Captain Sanchez. I stand before you today as the interim police chief, Sanchez said, her tone both solemn and determined. I won't sugarcoat it, our department has failed this community. We have allowed misconduct to go unchecked, and we have betrayed the trust placed in us. But that changes now. With your help, we will rebuild. Her words were met with cautious applause. While many in the room appreciated her candor, they also knew that words alone would not heal the wounds of the past. After the meeting, Marcus found himself surrounded by residents eager to share their stories. Parents recounted their children's encounters with officers who had treated them with suspicion simply because of their skin color. Elders spoke of years spent enduring quiet injustices, their voices ignored by those in power. One woman, a schoolteacher named Angela, approached Marcus with tears in her eyes. "Thank you for what you've done," she said. "Because of you, my students have hope. They see that change is possible." Marcus smiled faintly, humbled by her words. "It's not just me," he said. "It's all of us." As Angela walked away, Marcus felt a hand on his shoulder. He turned to see Reverend Carter, his face lined with both exhaustion and pride. "You've become the voice this town needed," Marcus Carter said. "But I know that weight isn't easy to carry." Marcus nodded. "It's not. But it's worth it." While the community worked to heal, Luke Patterson faced the consequences of his actions in a court of law. The trial had drawn national attention, with media outlets framing it as a pivotal case in the ongoing fight for police accountability. Marcus sat in the front row of the courtroom, his presence a reminder that this wasn't just a case, it was personal. Patrice and Jameer sat beside him, their hands clasped tightly together. The prosecution painted a damning picture of Patterson, presenting evidence of his long history of misconduct and his decision to kidnap Jameer. Witnesses testified to his pattern of racial profiling, and internal department emails exposed the culture of impunity that had protected him. When it was Patterson's turn to speak, he stood hesitantly, his shoulders slumped. "I made a mistake," he said, his voice barely audible. "I thought I was doing the right thing, but I see now that I wasn't. I'm sorry." Marcus watched him closely, searching for any trace of genuine remorse. While Patterson's words carried some weight, Marcus knew that one apology wouldn't erase the harm he had caused. The jury deliberated for only a few hours before returning with a verdict guilty on multiple charges, including kidnapping, false imprisonment, and abuse of power. Patterson was sentenced to 15 years in prison, a decision that sent shockwaves through the law enforcement community. As Patterson was led away in handcuffs, Marcus felt a sense of closure but not triumph. Justice had been served, but the real victory would come only if the town committed to meaningful change. In the weeks following the trial, Marcus and his family began to find moments of peace. Jameer returned to school, where his teachers and classmates treated him with newfound respect. He even joined the school's debate team, channeling his experiences into passionate arguments about justice and fairness. Patrice, too, found solace in helping others. She organized support groups for parents whose children had faced similar challenges, creating a safe space for them to share their fears and hopes. As for Marcus, he continued to work with the Oversight Committee, leveraging his FBI experience to identify weaknesses in the police department's policies. But he also made time for his family, cherishing the moments he had almost lost. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Marcus and Jameer sat on the porch, watching fireflies dance in the twilight. "Dad," Jameer said, breaking the silence, "do you think people can really change?" Marcus considered the question carefully. "I think some people can," he said. "But it takes a lot of work. And it starts with admitting you were wrong." Jameer nodded thoughtfully. "Do you think Officer Patterson will change?" "I don't know," Marcus admitted. "But I hope so. Because if he does, maybe he'll help others change too." Greenfield Heights was no longer the same town it had been before Jameer's ordeal. The Oversight Committee had become a permanent fixture, and its influence was already being felt. Complaints against officers were investigated thoroughly, and policies on use of force and racial profiling were revised. Captain Sanchez, now officially sworn in as the town's police chief, implemented mandatory bias training for all officers and established regular community meetings to build trust. Slowly but surely, the town began to heal. At the annual Fall Festival, Marcus and his family joined the community in celebrating their progress. Jameer was invited to speak on stage, a moment that filled Marcus with pride. "Hi everyone," Jameer began, his voice steady. "A lot has happened this year, and it wasn't easy. But because of all of you, because we stood together, things are getting better. My dad always says we're stronger than we think, and now I know he's right. Thank you for helping me feel safe again." The crowd erupted into applause, their cheers echoing through the festival grounds. Marcus watched his son, his heart swelling with love and gratitude. As the festival wound down, Marcus took a moment to reflect. The journey wasn't over. There would always be challenges to face, injustices to fight. But for the first time in a long while, he felt hopeful. Walking hand in hand with Patrice and Jameer, Marcus looked up at the night sky, the stars shining brightly above. "Ready to head home?" Patrice asked, her voice warm. Marcus smiled. "Yeah, let's go home." The seasons had shifted in Greenfield Heights, and with them, a new sense of purpose had settled over the town. The biting cold of winter had given way to the fresh bloom of spring, the warmth in the air mirroring the slow but steady progress of a community determined to heal. For Marcus Brown, the past months had been a whirlwind of triumphs and trials, but as the world around him began to thaw, he found himself reflecting on the road that had brought him and his family to this moment. At the Brown household, the morning sun spilled through the kitchen windows, casting a golden glow on the breakfast table. Jameer sat with a pencil in hand, working diligently on a school project about heroes. Beside him, Patrice sipped her coffee, glancing occasionally at her son's work with a proud smile. "What are you writing about, buddy?" Marcus asked as he joined them, a steaming cup of tea in his hand. Jameer looked up, his eyes bright. "I'm writing about you, Dad." Marcus blinked, caught off guard. "Me? What did I do to deserve that?" Jameer shrugged, grinning. "You helped me, and not just me, you helped everyone." Patrice reached over to squeeze Marcus's hand, her eyes filled with warmth. "He's right, you know." Marcus chuckled softly, his heart swelling with gratitude. "Well, I couldn't have done it without both of you." Their quiet moment was interrupted by the sound of a text notification on Marcus's phone. He glanced at the screen and saw a message from Reverend Carter. "Big day today. See you at the rally." Later that afternoon, Marcus and his family made their way to the town square, where the rally was already underway. Hundreds of people had gathered, their voices a harmonious blend of determination and hope. The banners and signs they carried bore messages like justice for all and reform, not excuses. At the center of the square, a stage had been erected, and community leaders, including Reverend Carter and Captain Sanchez, stood ready to address the crowd. As Marcus and his family arrived, a wave of cheers rippled through the gathering. He was no longer just an FBI agent or a father. He had become a symbol of the fight for accountability and change. "Look at this," Patrice whispered, her voice filled with awe. "This is what we've been working for." Jameer tugged on Marcus's sleeve. "Are you going to speak, Dad?" Marcus hesitated, glancing at the expectant faces in the crowd. "I wasn't planning to." "You should," Patrice said, her tone firm but encouraging. "They need to hear from you." When Marcus stepped onto the stage, the noise of the crowd faded into a respectful hush. He adjusted the microphone, his mind racing as he tried to find the right words. "Thank you all for being here," he began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "Today, we're not just standing together as a community, we're standing for something bigger. We're standing for justice, for accountability, and for a future where no child has to go through what my son went through." He paused, letting his words sink in. What happened to Jameer wasn't an accident. It was the result of a system that has been broken for far too long. But here's the thing: systems don't fix themselves. People fix them. People like you. The crowd erupted into applause, their cheers echoing through the square. "We've already taken the first steps," Marcus continued. "We've exposed the corruption, we've held those responsible accountable. But the work doesn't end here. Change isn't a destination, it's a journey. And it's one we have to walk together." Marcus looked out at the sea of faces, his gaze lingering on Jameer, who stood in the front row, his chest puffed with pride. "I'm proud of this town," Marcus said, his voice breaking slightly. "Not because we've always been perfect, but because we've chosen to confront our imperfections. That's what courage looks like." The applause that followed was deafening, a wave of support and gratitude that seemed to lift Marcus off the stage as he stepped down. Miles away, in a small, sterile prison cell, Luke Patterson sat alone. The news of the rally had reached him through the grapevine of prison gossip, and though he would never admit it aloud, it gnawed at him. For months, Luke had been forced to confront his actions, Therapy sessions and mandated racial bias training had peeled back layers of defensiveness he hadn't even realized were there. He thought often of Jameer, the fear in the boy's eyes and the resilience he had shown despite it. Luke picked up a pen and a sheet of paper. He hesitated for a moment, then began to write. "Dear Jameer," he started, the words feeling heavy and inadequate. "I don't expect you to forgive me, but I need you to know I'm sorry. What I did was wrong. You deserve better." He stopped writing, staring at the unfinished letter. For the first time in years, Luke allowed himself to feel something other than anger or self-pity. He felt shame and the faintest glimmer of a desire to be better. Back in Greenfield Heights, the rally had given way to a celebration. Food trucks lined the streets, and music filled the air as residents danced and laughed together. For the first time in years, the divisions that had once fractured the community seemed to fade. Marcus stood with Patrice and Jameer, watching his neighbors who had once been strangers embraced like old friends. "This is how it should have always been," Patrice said, leaning into Marcus's side. "It's a start," Marcus replied, wrapping an arm around her. "But we've still got work to do." As the sun set over Greenfield Heights, Marcus and Jameer walked through Elmwood Park, retracing the route Jameer had taken on the night that had changed everything. The park was alive with activity, children laughing, families picnicking, teenagers playing basketball under the newly installed lights. "Does it feel different now?" Marcus asked, glancing down at Jameer. "A little," Jameer admitted. "But I think it'll take time." Marcus nodded. "That's okay. Change takes time. But what's important is that we're moving forward." They stopped near the playground, where a small plaque had been installed beneath a newly planted tree. The plaque read, "In honor of Jameer Brown and the fight for justice. May we always strive to be better." Jameer traced the words with his fingers, a smile spreading across his face. "It's nice," he said softly. "It is," Marcus agreed, his voice thick with emotion. "And so are you." As they walked home, the stars began to emerge, their light faint but unwavering. Marcus felt a deep sense of peace, not because the fight was over, but because it was moving in the right direction. "Dad," Jameer said, breaking the silence, "do you think things will really change?" Marcus looked at his son, his heart swelling with pride and hope. "They already have," he said, "and they'll keep changing as long as people like you keep standing up for what's right." With that, father and son walked into the night, their steps steady and their path clear.